Hey, yeah, thanks, Mina. I am today talking about a paper that I did with Mina a few years ago using both the genetic data and the measurements of testosterone that were included as part of the biomarker wave. And forgive the garbage truck that just went by very loudly outside. So this was a paper that was published in Social Science and Medicine, I think at the start of 2019, if anyone is interested in looking it up, called Testosterone Risk and Socioeconomic Position in British Men, Exploring Causal Directionality. So the background to this and why we wanted to use the testosterone data in this way is that testosterone has, for a long time, for decades or more than decades, been of a lot of interest in the study of primate behavior, including human behavior. And there are sort of various lines of evidence feeding into this, part of which is experimental data. So there are a number of experiments sort of in the 20th century and more recently as well, in which testosterone administration in experimental contexts was shown to promote various kinds of behaviors, so kind of more aggressive behaviors, also potentially pro-social behaviors in certain experimental setups, and also to affect financial decision making, and in particular increased risk taking in kind of experimental gambling contexts. So all of that kind of was the background to there being a lot of interest in not just scientific circles, but sort of culture and the media at large in testosterone in the wake of the 2008 economic crash. So there was quite an interesting period where you were getting lots of headlines like this, of lots of angry, stressed, and aggressive looking men crashing the economy in lots of fairly reputable newspapers, which was interesting. So there was a lot of kind of cultural interest in this, but it wasn't actually clear how much the evidence supported a lot of the claims that were being made for the importance of testosterone on humans' behavior, at least in the kind of economic realm. A related question that people started asking was whether testosterone, at least in male humans, more broadly influence kind of socioeconomic success. And forgive the fire alarm. Yeah, stopped. So related lines of evidence feeding into this were coming from a couple of studies, one of which had shown that in a cross-sectional study of male executives, those with higher circulating testosterone in their blood had more people working under them. So it was related to seniority. There was another study of traders in the City of London, which showed that the men who on the morning of a given day had higher testosterone in their blood made greater profits that day in their trading. And there were some other studies looking at the effects of in utero testosterone. So yeah, the extent to which you're exposed to testosterone during your development in the womb, which suggested that, at least for men, higher testosterone exposure in the womb predicted greater earnings in adulthood. And that was quite interesting because it's very difficult to explain that by reverse causation, because your earnings in adulthood can't affect how much testosterone you are exposed to in the womb. So that was taken as reasonably strong evidence for an effect of testosterone on these behaviors and or on socioeconomic outcomes, and by implication behaviors that might mediate that relationship. Although it's important to state as a caveat that the effects of testosterone exposure in the womb are not, you can't necessarily extrapolate that to saying that would also apply to the effects of circulating testosterone in adulthood, because there's a lot of important stuff around brain development going on during your time in the womb, and that wouldn't necessarily, so those things may be more sensitive. Okay, so nevertheless, there are kind of circumstantial reasons to start thinking about whether testosterone might causally impact on socioeconomic position, measured in various ways over a longer period, and that would be via potential effects on behavior. So mechanisms that have been suggested for this are things around wage bargaining. So either willingness to engage in wage bargaining or how good you are at it once you've chosen to engage in it, which would, you can imagine, at least in certain industries, could have a big effect on, for example, how much you're earning. Also occupational choice. So whether you would choose to go into a high risk but potentially with high returns industry like financial trading, and also pursuing self-employment, which is as opposed to traditional employment, which is a riskier strategy, but again potentially has quite high returns. What's important to state, though, is that for any observed relationship between higher testosterone in the bloodstream among adults and higher, for example, wages, there are other explanations that aren't about the higher testosterone causally impacting the wages. So we know that socioeconomic adversity is strongly linked with psychosocial stress. There's a huge huge literature on that. But we also know that chronic stress can lower testosterone. So this could be a case of reversed causation if you see an association. It could be that the socioeconomic adversity is lowering testosterone, and that's what's responsible for an observed gradient in a cross-sectional study. There's also evidence from experiments that self-perceived social status can also influence testosterone. So in both experimental setups and observational studies of professional tennis players, testosterone has been shown to rise more in the winner than in the loser if you compare before and after testosterone measurements, before and after a tennis match or an experimental kind of analog. So, you know, you can imagine processes kind of maybe building up over a lifetime of people who, you know, are doing well, that might raise their testosterone because of how it makes them perceive themselves and their relative status. It's also very possible that all of this could just be confounded by health. So we know that higher testosterone, at least in males, is associated with better health in a bunch of different dimensions. And it goes without saying that better health is strongly and positively associated with more advantaged socioeconomic positions. So there's a strong reason to think that confounding might be something to watch out for here. So quite a lot of background here, sorry. So in summary, there's quite a lot of circumstantial evidence for an effect of adult testosterone on socioeconomic position, but nothing that's, you know, proving it for sure. The causal directionality is poorly understood, and there's been very little work in general population samples. So both in the experiments, they tended to be very small and non-random samples, and also ones that were, even the work that was not experimental was done in financial traders or professional sports players who I think it's fair to say might differ from other people for psychological reasons. So we approached this in Understanding Society, and that was a really interesting thing to do because it allowed us to do the first, sort of make the first description of socioeconomic differences in a large representative sample which spanned the whole age range. And that hadn't really been done before because, yeah, it's not normally measured in general population samples. And we were able to go one step further using the genetic data. So in order to disentangle causal processes, we applied an approach called Mendelian Randomization, which uses genetic variants, usually, and in this case, single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs, using those as instrumental variables to get a kind of slightly more causal handle on a relationship that's liable to confounding. So extremely briefly, this is a directed acyclic graph to illustrate what Mendelian randomization is. It's useful when you think there's reverse causation or confounding likely in a relationship. So because single nucleotide polymorphisms are assigned at conception, while an association between measured testosterone in the blood and, say, income could be the result of causation or reverse causation or confounding, an association of SNPs associated with testosterone and your outcome, so income or whatever, cannot be due to reverse causation or at least classical kinds of confounding, because nothing can affect those SNPs after conception, including confounders, environmental confounders. So a really nice example of how this was applied to kind of myth bust was around the idea that drinking a glass of wine every day is actively good for health. The Mendelian randomization work that was done around this suggests that actually that was probably confounding by kind of socioeconomic differences. So we applied this approach in around 3,600 men from the UKHLS, so those who were present at the nurse visit, who who were present at the nurse visit, who had the necessary information on the testosterone biomarker and the genetic data, and who were not taking anabolic steroids, of whom there were 2, so that didn't mean chucking out many people. A quick note is that testosterone circulates in 3 forms. So there's free testosterone, which is that's circulating around the bloodstream unbound to anything. Then there's the kind of testosterone which is loosely bound to albumin. Those 2 together constitute bioavailable testosterone. And it's called bioavailable because testosterone in those 2 forms is more able to kind of interact with stuff, so you'd expect it to have more of an effect on tissues and behavior. There's a third kind, which is testosterone tightly bound to sex hormone binding globulin. The 3 together make up total testosterone. We were only able to look at total testosterone, but in men under the age of 70, they're all very closely correlated. And as a robustness check, we restricted analyses to men in that range to see if anything looked different. A genetic instrument was a polygenic score. So that is basically a way of summarizing information from multiple single nucleotide polymorphisms. So this was based on 3 genetic variants that had been previously associated with testosterone in a genome-wide association study. And it was weighted to allow more influence of the SNPs, which seem to have a bigger influence on testosterone. And it was a nice, strong instrument, according to the F statistic. We looked at a range of socioeconomic position measures, so equivalized household income, earnings from employment or self-employment, people's employment status, so whether they were working or not, also whether they were self-employed specifically because of the previous literature around that, 2 specifications of all people and conditional on working. A measure of education, kind of standardized to take account of the fact that younger generations tend to be more educated than older generations. And also a measure of self-assessed risk-taking, which may be a key mediator of relationships here. So participants were asked, are you generally a person who is fully prepared to take risks, or do you try to avoid taking risks? And they describe themselves by answering on a scale of 0 to 10. So we did descriptive age curves, firstly, by socioeconomic groups for income and education in age standardized tertiles. And that was quite nice because, yeah, as I said, the sort of lack of testosterone measures in general population samples, especially those across an age range, means that this hadn't really been done before. So we firstly just sort of described these things in non-clinical populations. We then did non-genetic models, so just a kind of adjusted observational standard model to look at socioeconomic differences. And then we did the MR models. So that was equivalent, but only adjusting for the things which it makes sense to adjust for in a genetic model. And did some robustness checks, which I'm not going to go into because I'm running over time. So this is the age curve for all men, and you can see that it drops quite a lot through the age span in a way that had been seen in clinical samples, but it was nice to replicate this in a general population sample. This is the age curves, but separated into household income tertiles, and yeah, you can see there's actually there are no clear differences, so that was interesting. Similarly, by educational qualifications, some of these confidence intervals are are not small, but it was interesting that we didn't see clear socioeconomic differences in just the observational non-genetic models. These are the results of the multivariable regression and the Mendelian randomization, so on the left and the right respectively. And consistent with the age curves, there's not a lot of evidence for socioeconomic differences from the non-genetic models. In the Mendelian randomization models, there is suggestive evidence for a causal effect of testosterone on both earnings and whether people are in employment or not, but not on other aspects of socioeconomic position. You can see that, yeah, so these both had a p-value of like 0.06, so it's kind of borderline significant, but that was an interesting contrast between the MR models and the other models and the non-genetic models. Robustness checks were consistent with main results, and no strong evidence of bias in the MR models. So summing up, this was the first such examination of social differences in testosterone in a mixed age general population sample. And it was a really nice way to use the fine-grained income data that Understanding Society has. First application of MR to investigate this question. We found little evidence of socioeconomic differences, at least from the non-genetic models, which contrast with an earlier study in the 1946 birth cohorts. And we tried quite hard to replicate that and still couldn't find it, even when we tried to match the specification. And yeah, I wonder if that might reflect the fact that by the time the 1946 birth cohort were in their 60s when that study was done, it wasn't very representative, whereas Understanding Society, one of its main strengths is that it is extremely representative. So yeah, maybe that is the explanation for that difference. Yeah, so we're still not entirely sure why there is this difference between the MR results that suggested an impact on earnings and employment and the observational models, which absolutely didn't. This could indicate maybe sort of negative confounding in the observational models, which the MR was able to deal with. So interestingly, smoking raises testosterone. So it's possible that socioeconomic gradients in smoking could could actually mask an association rather than inflating one in the observational models. There could have been an influence of pleiotropy, which is a particular kind of bias you can get in MR studies. We didn't find any strong evidence for that, but there could have been subtle evidence, a subtle influence of that we couldn't pick up. It could also reflect the fact that MR is better at picking up kind of the effects of stable lifetime traits as opposed to short-term fluctuations in biological things. So yeah, we're still thinking about that. Next steps were to replicate this in a larger sample, which I did with colleagues at Bristol later in the UK Biobank, and I realized I should have put a citation for that. That was Harrison et al. 2021, if anyone's interested. So we replicated it in a much larger sample, and interestingly, so UK Biobank is huge but less representative and has a restricted age range, much less representative and has a restricted age range. And interestingly, there again, we found clear evidence for social differences in the non-genetic models, but not in the MR models. So that was a bit more like the study in the 1946 birth cohort. So I wonder if what's going on here is that both of those studies which found evidence for social differences in the non-genetic models, both of those studies are a lot less representative than Understanding Society. So we did that. I think another important step, which we've not yet done, is to look at longitudinal analysis, if at all possible, in a representative sample. So other work in UKHLS has looked at mechanisms specifically around employment transitions, rather than kind of long-term things like educational attainment, and found some evidence that testosterone may be implicated specifically in those kinds of processes. But yeah, to sum up, all causal inference methods have limitations. So I think triangulation between genetic and longitudinal and also natural experimental kind of designs are going to be crucial for unpicking this further. Thank you.